Picture a single ship, alone on an endless ocean. No land in any direction, no other sail on the horizon. Just blue water stretching out to the curve of the earth in every direction, and one wooden vessel crawling across the middle of it, riding low and heavy in the swell. To a sailor on a passing ship, it would have looked like nothing special. A big ship, sure. A slow ship. A ship that wallowed when the waves hit it and groaned when the wind pushed against its towering sides. But here is the thing that almost nobody watching it could have known. At that exact moment, that one ugly, slow, groaning wooden ship was the single most valuable object on the entire planet. Not a palace, not a cathedral, not a king's treasury locked behind stone walls. A ship, down in its belly, packed into chests and stacked in bars and poured into the gaps between the timbers, sat more silver than most entire kingdoms saw in a decade. Tons of it. Mountains of refined metal dug out of the earth on the other side of the world, smelted, stamped, and loaded into the dark hold of one vessel that now had to carry it across two oceans without sinking, without surrendering, and without being torn apart by the men who hunted it. This was the Galleon, and it was not really a ship in the way we think of ships. It was a fortress, a castle that floated, a walking treasury with cannons in its walls and soldiers on its decks, built for one purpose above all others: to carry the wealth of an empire through the most dangerous waters on Earth and survive. The Galleon was the strongest, proudest, most heavily defended vessel of its age, and for 200 years it ruled the oceans like a moving piece of solid ground. But here is what almost every telling of this story leaves out. The Galleon was not feared because it was a weapon. It was feared because it was a prize. Every wave it crossed, every port it left, every mile of open water it covered, it did so with a target painted on its hull the size of a kingdom. The same strength that made it untouchable made it the most hunted object in human history. And in the end, the floating fortress that men built to be unconquerable would be undone, again and again, not by stronger ships or bigger guns, but by something far stranger. To understand why, you have to go back to the moment the world cracked open, and somebody realized that finding treasure was the easy part. Bringing it home alive was the problem that nobody had solved. By the early 16th century, the impossible had already happened. The small, fast ships of the previous age had done their work. The caravels and the carracks had crawled down the coast of Africa, leapt across the Atlantic, and stitched the shape of the world together for the first time. Europe now knew that the planet was far bigger, far richer, and far stranger than anyone had imagined. There were continents nobody had charted. There were islands by the thousand. And most importantly, there was wealth. Staggering, unimaginable, world-changing wealth, sitting in places that had no defenses against the men who came to take it. The Spanish, in particular, had hit something close to a miracle. In the mountains of South America, in a place called Potosi, they found a single mountain that was practically made of silver. Not a vein, not a seam, a mountain. The richest silver deposit the world had ever seen, and the Spanish crown owned it. Down in those mines, under conditions that killed men by the thousand, an ocean of silver was being dug out of the rock every single year, and every ounce of it had to get to Spain. That was the problem, not finding the treasure, moving it. Because here is what the ships of the previous age could not do: they could not defend anything. The caravel had been a genius of a vessel, a tool for slipping along coastlines and darting across open water, but it was small, lightly built, and armed with almost nothing. The carrack was bigger and could haul more cargo, but it was a fat, clumsy target, slow to turn and easy to overwhelm. These ships had been designed to discover the world, not to fight for it. They were explorers and haulers. They were not warriors. And now the world had changed underneath them. The oceans that had once been empty highways were filling up with shipping. Silver from the Americas, gold from West Africa, sugar from the Caribbean, silk and porcelain and spice from Asia, all of it flowing in vast quantities across thousands of miles of open water. The treasure was moving, and where treasure moves, predators gather. French raiders prowled the Atlantic approaches. English captains with royal blessings cruised the trade routes looking for fat targets. Independent pirates carved out hunting grounds in the Caribbean, and every one of them understood the same simple truth. A treasure ship that cannot fight is not a ship. It is a delivery. Spain had become the richest empire on earth, and it had a terrible vulnerability hiding inside that wealth. Its fortune was scattered across the most dangerous water in the world, riding in ships that could not protect it. What it needed did not exist yet. It needed something impossible, a ship that could carry the cargo of a warehouse, fight like a man-o'-war, and survive the open ocean for months at a time. A vessel that was three contradictory things at once. A vault, a castle, and a long-distance traveler, all welded into a single hull. Nobody had ever built such a thing, because on paper it should not have been possible. A ship built to carry mountains of cargo is slow and clumsy. A ship built to fight is lean and lightly loaded. A ship built to cross oceans needs to be seaworthy above all. Trying to combine all three usually gave you a vessel that did none of them well. But the Spanish crown was not interested in what should have been possible. It had an empire's fortune to protect, and it was willing to spend almost anything to protect it. The solution, when it came, would not be a single invention. It would be a system, built by men who understood that the answer to losing ships to pirates was not a faster ship. It was a smarter way of moving treasure entirely. The man who turned that idea into a working machine was a Spanish commander named Pedro Menéndez de Avilés. He was not a shipwright. He was not an inventor in the way we think of inventors. He was something more useful. He was an organizer, a soldier, and a sailor who understood that the danger was not random. The pirates and raiders were not striking everywhere at once. They were striking the weak, the slow, the isolated ships caught alone on the open sea. And a lone ship, no matter how strong, could always be cornered, outnumbered, and worn down. So Menendez built a system around a brutal piece of logic. If a single ship could be hunted, then ships would no longer travel singly. The treasure would move in convoys, great fleets sailing together. Dozens of cargo vessels surrounded and shepherded by heavily armed escorts, departing on fixed schedules, following defended routes, gathering at fortified ports. This was the birth of what the Spanish called the Carrera de Indias, the Great Run of the Indies, the most ambitious shipping operation the world had ever seen. And at the heart of that system, doing the heaviest work, sat the ship that everything depended on, the galleon. The escorts that protected the fleets had to be powerful enough to drive off any attacker. The cargo carriers that hauled the silver had to be capable of fighting if the escorts failed. The flagships that led the convoys had to be floating command centers strong enough to anchor an entire fleet around them. One kind of ship had to be all of these things, in different sizes and configurations, all built on the same idea. The obsession that drove the whole enterprise was simple and relentless. Get the silver of Potosi home alive. Every year, the wealth had to make the journey. From the mines high in the Andes, the silver came down by mule train to the Pacific coast. It was carried up to Panama, hauled across the narrow jungle isthmus on the backs of men and animals, loaded onto ships on the Caribbean side, and gathered into the great treasure fleets that would attempt the long, dangerous crossing back to Spain. And on the other side of the world, an even longer and stranger version of the same journey was beginning to take shape across the Pacific, linking Asia to the Americas in a single unbroken chain of trade. Every link in that chain was a place where the treasure could be lost, to storms, to shipwreck, to disease, and above all to the men who waited along the routes, watching for any ship that drifted out of the protection of the fleet. The whole system existed to defeat those men, and the ship at the center of it had to be the answer to a question that the world had been asking for a century. How do you build something that can carry a fortune across the deadliest oceans on Earth and still arrive in one piece? The answer was about to change the shape of every navy in the world. The galleon did not appear out of nowhere. Like every great ship, it evolved, and it evolved out of frustration with what came before. The carrack had been the workhorse of early ocean travel, a big round-hulled vessel with towering structures built up at the bow and the stern. Those tall castles at each end had been useful in the old style of sea fighting, where battles were really just land battles fought on floating platforms, with soldiers shooting down and boarding across. But they were a disaster for sailing. They caught the wind like sails in all the wrong places. They made the ship roll and pitch, and they turned an ocean crossing into a clumsy, top-heavy struggle. Shipwrights began to ask a dangerous question. What if you cut the front castle down? What if you stretched the hull out longer and lower and leaner, so the ship sliced through the water instead of wallowing across it? What if, instead of a floating box with towers on it, you built something closer to a floating blade with a fortress in the back? That is, in essence, what the galleon became. The bow was lowered and sharpened. The hull was lengthened, often 3 or 4 times longer than it was wide, giving it a sleeker, faster shape that handled the open ocean far better than the old round-bellied carrack. The high castle was kept at the stern, where it became a genuine stronghold, a multi-decked fortress of officers' quarters and fighting positions that loomed over the back of the ship. And along the sides, in rows that defined the entire purpose of the vessel, came the guns. This was the real revolution. The galleon was built around its broadside. Heavy cannon lined the decks, firing out through ports cut into the hull, and the whole ship was designed so that those guns could be brought to bear on an enemy. A fully armed war galleon could carry dozens of cannon, sometimes 60 or more on the largest vessels, arranged on multiple decks so that a single turn of the ship could unleash a wall of iron. The galleon did not need to grapple and board an enemy in the old way. It could stand off and pound a target to splinters with firepower alone. It was, for its age, a floating artillery battery, and there was very little on the ocean that could survive a direct fight with one. The numbers tell the story. A typical war galleon might run 500 to 1,000 tons, dwarfing the little caravels of the previous age that had measured in the dozens. The great Manila galleons that crossed the Pacific were monsters even by these standards, some of them swelling to over 1,000 or even 2,000 tons, the largest wooden ships afloat in their day. They carried crews of hundreds, soldiers and sailors and gunners packed onto the decks. They bristled with cannon. And below all of that, in holds built to swallow the wealth of empires, they carried cargo by the hundreds of tons. But raw size was never the whole genius of the design. The galleon was a balancing act, a compromise pushed to the edge of what was possible. It had to be heavy enough to carry treasure but seaworthy enough to survive months at sea. It had to be armed enough to fight but stable enough that all those guns did not roll it over in a storm. The lowered forecastle helped. The longer hull helped. The careful arrangement of weight, with the heaviest guns on the lower decks to keep the center of gravity down, helped. Every part of the ship was a negotiation between 3 demands that pulled in different directions, and when it was done well, the result was something that genuinely deserved its reputation. A fortress that could sink, yes, but a fortress that, handled right, almost never did. To the men who built them and sailed them, these ships were the proudest objects in the world. A great galleon under full sail, hull gleaming, banners streaming, gun ports open and ready, was a deliberate statement of power. It said that the empire behind it could afford to build a castle and send it across the sea. It said that anyone foolish enough to attack would face a wall of iron and a deck full of soldiers. For 2 centuries, that statement was largely true. The galleon was the floating embodiment of an empire's strength, and when the system worked, it worked spectacularly. And work it did. Once the galleon and the fleet system were running, the wealth that poured into Spain reshaped the entire world. The treasure fleets became the beating heart of a global economy that had never existed before, an unbroken circulation of silver and gold and goods moving on a scale that staggered everyone who witnessed it. Twice a year, the great fleets gathered in the Caribbean, dozens of ships forming up under the protection of their war galleons, holds packed with the silver of Potosi and the gold and pearls and exotic goods of the Americas. They crossed the Atlantic together, a moving city of sails, and arrived in Spain to unload a fortune that funded armies, built palaces, paid debts and waged wars across an entire continent. The silver of one mountain in South America ended up financing conflicts in Europe, buying goods in Asia, and rippling through markets on 3 continents. For the first time in history, the world had a truly global flow of money, and the galleon was the vessel that carried it. On the far side of the world, the system reached its most astonishing form. Across the Pacific, the longest and richest trade route on Earth came to life, running between Manila in the Philippines and Acapulco on the coast of Mexico. The Manila galleons made one of the most grueling voyages a sailing ship could attempt, a crossing of thousands of miles of open Pacific that could take 5 or 6 months in each direction. They carried Asian silk, porcelain, spices, and luxury goods east to the Americas, and they carried American silver west to pay for it all. A single successful Manila galleon could make its investors rich beyond imagining. For 2.5 centuries, this one route was the thread that tied Asia, the Americas, and Europe into a single connected economy. This was the payoff. The galleon had solved the impossible problem. It had become the vault, the castle, and the traveler all at once, and it had turned Spain into the first empire on which, quite literally, the sun never set. From the silver mountains of Peru to the trading ports of the Philippines, from the jungles of Panama to the harbors of Seville, an entire interconnected world ran on the back of these ships. Decade after decade, the fleet sailed and arrived, and the wealth kept flowing. The system that men had built to protect a fortune had become the engine that ran the planet. And for a long time it seemed unbreakable. The galleons were too strong to attack, too well defended to corner, too powerful to challenge. The wealth was too vast, the system too organized, the ships too formidable. The floating fortress had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had made the treasure untouchable. Except that it had not. And here is where the story takes the turn that almost every telling rushes past. Because the galleon's strength was also its curse. Every ounce of armor, every cannon, every soldier on its decks, every legend about its power, did one thing above all others. It advertised the prize. A ship that powerful was not protecting an ordinary cargo. It was protecting something worth a king's ransom, and everyone on the ocean knew it. The galleon was not just a fortress. It was a fortress with a sign on it that read, "The most valuable thing in the world is inside this ship." And nothing in human history has ever attracted ambition like an impossible prize. The men who hunted the galleons were not fools throwing themselves at cannon. They understood that you could not simply outgun a floating fortress in a fair fight, so they did not fight fair. They learned that the way to take the strongest ship on the ocean was not with more strength. It was with patience, with deception, with timing, and above all with the willingness to gamble everything on a single reckless act of nerve. Consider what the English captain Francis Drake did off the Pacific coast of South America. The Pacific was supposed to be the safe ocean. The Spanish treasure ships that sailed up that coast carrying silver from Peru did not even expect an enemy, because no enemy had ever reached those waters before. Drake had done the impossible just by getting there, slipping around the bottom of the Americas, and emerging into a sea that the Spanish believed was entirely their own. And there, in 1579, he found a treasure ship so famous that her own crew had nicknamed her the Cacafugo, the fire thrower, after her guns. Drake did not blast his way to her. He crept up on her in the dark, his ship disguised, moving slow and harmless so as not to spook his prey. By the time the Spanish realized what was bearing down on them, it was too late. The treasure ship was caught, boarded, and stripped of a fortune in silver and gold that took days to transfer between the vessels. The strongest prize in the Pacific had fallen, and it had fallen not to overwhelming force, but to a single audacious captain who understood that surprise was worth more than any cannon. A few years later, in 1587, another English captain named Thomas Cavendish did something even more daring. He had crossed into the Pacific the same brutal way, and he made a calculated bet. He knew that the great Manila Galleon, the richest single ship in the world, would have to make its return crossing along a predictable stretch of coast off Baja California. So he waited. He cruised those waters and he waited for one of the most valuable vessels on the planet to come to him. And it did. The galleon Santa Ana appeared, fat with the wealth of an entire trans-Pacific voyage. She was enormous, but Cavendish caught her at her most vulnerable, and after a long and desperate fight, the floating fortress surrendered. One of the proudest ships of the Spanish Empire was taken by a captain who had simply understood where she would be and refused to leave. These are the famous stories, the ones of daring and nerve. But the strangest truth of all is that pirates and raiders were never the galleon's deadliest enemy. The fortress that men built to defeat human predators was, again and again, destroyed by something it could not fight at all. Greed sank more galleons than Drake and Cavendish combined. The ships were so valuable, and the cargoes worth so much, that owners and captains routinely overloaded them far beyond what was safe. Decks meant for cannon were packed with extra goods. Holds were stuffed past capacity. Passengers smuggled aboard chest after chest of unregistered silver, weighing the ships down lower and lower into the water. A galleon designed with a careful balance between cargo and seaworthiness was turned into a sluggish, top-heavy, dangerously laden barge by the very wealth it was built to carry. And when the storms came, those overloaded fortresses did not float. They went straight to the bottom. And the storms always came. The hurricanes of the Caribbean and the typhoons of the Pacific destroyed entire fleets at a stroke. Galleons that no pirate could have touched were smashed against reefs, swallowed by waves, and scattered across the seafloor in the space of a single terrible night. The greatest enemy of the floating fortress was never an enemy with a sword. It was the ocean itself, and the bottomless human appetite that loaded these ships until they could barely swim. So here is the truth that the legends miss. The galleon was indeed almost impossible to defeat in honest battle, but almost nobody defeated it in honest battle. It fell to bluff and patience and surprise. To the reckless daring of a handful of men willing to risk everything, and most of all to its own crushing weight of treasure. The unconquerable fortress was undone over and over by deception, by ambition, and by the sea. Its strength was real, but its strength was never the whole story. By the late 17th and into the 18th century, the great age of the galleon was fading. Naval warfare was changing, and the ship that had ruled the oceans for 200 years was being overtaken by something it had helped create. The lessons of the galleon, the rows of broadside cannon, the long, lean fighting hull, the idea of a ship built around its firepower, did not disappear. They evolved into something even more formidable. The galleon was the direct ancestor of the ship of the line, the towering wooden battleships that would dominate naval warfare for the next century and more. Those great fighting ships, with their multiple gun decks and their thunderous broadsides, were the galleon's children, refined and specialized for war alone. The compromise had been broken apart. Warships became purely warships, and cargo ships became purely cargo ships, but the design language that ran through all of them had been written on the decks of the galleon. Every line of battleships that ever fought, every wooden wall that ever defended an empire, owed something to the floating fortress that came first. And the galleon left a second legacy, one that has nothing to do with warfare at all. It left us our dreams of treasure. Every story of sunken gold, every legend of a wreck lying in the dark with its fortune still aboard, every diver who has ever gone searching for lost riches on the seafloor is chasing the ghost of a galleon. Those overloaded ships that the storms sent to the bottom did not take their treasure with them into nothing. They scattered it across the floors of the world's oceans, where some of it still lies, where some of it is still found. The galleon gave us the single most powerful image of lost fortune in human history, and we have never stopped looking for it. So look one more time at that ship on the horizon. Slow, heavy, groaning in the swell. Men built the strongest thing the ocean had ever carried, a castle that could sail, a vault that could fight, a fortress that ruled the seas for 2 centuries. They built it to be untouchable. And that is exactly what doomed it. Because the stronger they made it, the more it was worth, and the more it was worth, the more men were willing to risk everything to take it. The fortress that could not be conquered by force was conquered by greed, by daring, and by the sea. Strength did not protect the galleon from ambition. Strength is what summoned the ambition in the first place. Remove the galleon from history, and the whole shape of the world bends. There is no global flow of silver, no first true world economy, no 2 centuries of Spanish dominance, no ship of the line, no Drake creeping through the dark Pacific, no Cavendish waiting off Baja for the richest ship on Earth, no sunken treasure waiting in the deep for someone bold enough to find it. The floating fortress did not just carry the wealth of an empire. It shaped the ambitions of everyone who lived in its shadow, for better and for worse. The next time you see a treasure chest in a story, or hear a tale of gold on the bottom of the sea, remember that it all traces back to a ship men believed could never be taken. They were almost right, and almost right on the open ocean was never enough. If you want to see the story of one of the boldest raids ever launched against the Spanish treasure system, the attack that turned a single captain into a legend and shook an empire to its core, that video is on screen now. Subscribe. I cover the real history behind the legends every week.